Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on this SOLAS webinar. Tonight, we are asking the question, is Christianity dying? And we've already had one objection to that question even being asked. Somebody said, SOLAS, come on, what are you doing asking a question like that? Well, let me explain why we're asking that question this evening. At the end of last year, we did a poll online to ask what topics we should look at in our webinars over 2021. And one of the atheists who follows us on Twitter said, what you should really be looking at is the inevitable decline of organized religion. And as you look at his Twitter feed, it was quite obvious that what he was suggesting across several of his comments was that Christianity, its time is gone. You know, we are, as Christians, on the wrong side of history. He alleges that our ideas are bankrupt, that our churches are emptying, and if you'd come back in 20 or 30 years' time, every Christian place of worship would be like a pine furniture showroom, a block of flats, or an art gallery. The accusation then is that secularization is inevitable, that the Christian faith really has no future. And that is a great question, one sort of accusation that we face all over the place where Solas works. It is a very common assumption. So thank you so much for putting that question in and raising this issue. It really is something very important that we should be looking at. In our webinars, we always have great guests, and this one is no exception at all this evening. I'm absolutely delighted that Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, one of my favorite authors, is going to be joining us this evening to discuss this question. Rebecca comes from these shores, although she now lives in the States. She did a PhD at Cambridge in English literature before moving to the United States to work for the Veritas Forum in 2008, working at the place where Christian faith interacts with the whole world of academia, working in campuses in universities across the States. In 2017, she founded a communications company. She's married with 3 children living in the States, and her book, Confronting Christianity, was one of my favorite reads of last year, a really interesting read in which she looks at 12 of the hardest questions that Christians have to answer. Everything from science to morality to isn't religion harmful? Does Christianity denigrate women? And more questions. That's a terrific read. And great that we're having the author of that great book joining us this evening. Rebecca, are you there? Can you see us?
I am. Well, I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. Whereabouts are you joining us from this evening?
I'm joining from New Cambridge, which the locals call Cambridge, Massachusetts. But actually, it should be New Cambridge because it's in New England, so it should be New Cambridge.
And it's what, mid-afternoon, something like that with you?
It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, tea time. So I have my cup of tea with me. I've lived in America for 12 years and I still don't drink coffee. Still a faithful tea drinker.
And are you facing a lockdown in your state there like we are in Scotland, or are you a bit freer?
Not as such. The area where I live is an area where people are very scrupulous about wearing masks and doing all the good things. But at a governmental level, it's actually relatively non-enforced compared to the UK in all sorts of ways.
Good
the land
stuff.
of the free here, apparently.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It really is appreciated. I'll hand over to you in just a second, but before I do that, just want to say to the folks watching at home, this is not going to be just a monologue. There is an opportunity to join in the discussion. And the way that we do that is we use a website called Pigeonhole. If you've been on our webinars before, you'll know just how that works. But bear with me, please, if you haven't been on a Solas webinar before and you're not sure. So just let me explain. If you go across on your web browser to pigeonhole.at, it will ask you to put in a code. And if you put in the code SOLAS25Feb, that will open up a little Q&A panel just for this evening's discussion. And you can ask Rebecca any question around this whole topic of secularization, the death of Christianity, and any of the things that she's going to speak to us about in the next few minutes. The joy of Pigeonhole is you can also vote for comments or questions. So if you log into Pigeonhole and you see the question that you are going to ask, instead of repeating it, click on it, vote for it, comes to the top of the list, and we will get through as many of those questions as we can in the second half of the webinar. Our producer, David, will put that up at several points during the evening, so don't worry if you didn't catch the Pigeonhole bit and the code at this stage. That will be repeated. You will have an opportunity to see that again later on. But without further ado, I'm going to hand right over to Rebecca now, and she's going to take us through the first half of our webinar. Rebecca, is our atheist friend right? Has Christianity got no future? Are its ideas redundant, and are Christians on the wrong side of history? Rebecca?
No, but I will say more. One of my favorite things in life is to have friends who are much cleverer than I am. Or in America, we say much smarter, which is very confusing. much cleverer than I am. And a guy who I sort of picked up along the way when I was doing a PhD at Cambridge is now a professor at Harvard University, which is close to where I live, a very dear friend of mine from my graduate studies days. And he grew up in a practicing Jewish family, but where it was very clear in his family that nobody actually believed in God. And so as we got to know each other in grad school in proper Cambridge in the UK, we frequently had conversations about faith. And when I moved over here to Cambridge, Mass, one of the really fun things was reconnecting with him and having some more of these conversations with him. And a few years ago, I invited this friend with his then girlfriend to an event at Harvard in which a New Testament scholar based in Scotland, actually named N.T. Wright, was in dialogue with the agnostic chair of the Harvard philosophy department. And the title of the event was Bible, Gospel, Guide, or Garbage. And after the event, I said to my friend, I know that you think that what I believe is crazy. And his then girlfriend, who was a much gentler soul than either of us, said, oh, I'm sure he doesn't think that. I said, yes, he does. I believe that the entirety of human history revolves around this first century Jewish man known as Jesus Christ, who died on a cross and was supposedly raised from the dead 3 days later. Crazy, right? My friend said, yes. I said, the problem is, I think that you believe some crazy things as well. Now, many of us who grew up in the West, and though this was certainly my experience growing up in the UK, have been taught to believe that there is a perfectly coherent secular belief system that does all the work that Christianity does for us, except without us having to believe in crazy things, like people rising from the dead. And that this more coherent way of understanding the world is growing and growing as religion in general, and Christianity in particular, shrinks and shrinks. But I want to suggest today that there is no such belief system. And that rather than Christianity dying out, it is actually growing in the modern world in ways that nobody expected. In our short time, I want to touch on 4 areas, science, psychology, ethics, and sociology. And I want to make 4 quite controversial claims. The first is, number 1, science hasn't disproved God. Number 2, humans aren't happy without God. Number 3, humans aren't better without God. And number 4, Christianity isn't shrinking, it's growing. Now, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective, as we're clear as I speak it in the Q&A. But from the outset, I want to say none of these claims is actually made on the basis of faith. In fact, all of them are ones which leading experts in those academic fields would have to agree. So number 1, science hasn't disproved God. And new atheists like Richard Dawkins have spent decades proclaiming that science offers us an alternative hypothesis to a creator God, a hypothesis which, unlike Christianity, is backed with actual evidence. Dawkins and his friends proclaim that science works and that it gives us an alternative explanation for everything that used to be explained by appealing to God. So that there's now actually no longer any need for us to believe in a creator God, an infinitely intelligent being who made the universe and everyone in it. But the belief in a creator God is actually irrational. Unfortunately, there are multiple problems with this hypothesis. The first problem is that the folks who developed what we now talk about as science, this process of testing a hypothesis against experimental data, actually came up with that idea because they believed in the creator God of the Bible. The first person I learned this from was a guy called Hans Halvorsen, who's a professor at Princeton University over here. He is a professor of philosophy and mathematics, and he's one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world. And he explains that the people who first developed the empirical method underlying what we now call science believe from the Bible that there is one God who made all things, and that this God is extremely intelligent, rational, and consistent. So they concluded that this kind of God made the universe according to rational principles. But because God of the Bible is also completely free, he could have made the universe any way he liked. So the only way for us to find out what those laws are is for us to go and look. Now, what's more, Professor Halvorsen, again, as I say, one of the top philosophers of science in the world, argues that even today, theism, belief in this creator God, offers a better philosophical foundation for science than atheism does. In fact, he says science doesn't actually give us a philosophical foundation for atheism doesn't give us a philosophical foundation for science at all. Of course, there are many leading atheist scientists, like my friend over at Harvard, But at a philosophical level, atheists just have to say, well, aren't we lucky that science works? Now, if we look back over the history of the last 400 years of modern science, we'll certainly see multiple examples of Christians arguing against scientific discoveries. And if we listen to new atheists like Richard Dawkins, we'll imagine that believers in God are kind of like children standing on sandcastles, like I used to do as a kid, counting the number of waves that would knock over my little sandcastle. And we're kids standing on these sandcastles of faith as wave after wave of scientific discovery wears us down until we're standing on a castle of faith that's flattened. That Christians like me are too arrogant or too deluded to acknowledge that our faith has failed. But if we look more closely at the history of science and faith, we'll find that Christians have actually been at the forefront of scientific discovery. And in every supposedly science versus Christianity debate, whether it's the age of the earth or evolution or the Big Bang, there have actually been Bible-believing Christians on both sides. As was mentioned earlier, I spent 9 years after I moved to the US working for something called the Veritas Forum. And there I had the chance to interact with world-class scholars at the tops of their fields in all sorts of fields. I met with Christians who are professors in every scientific discipline that is supposed to have disproved the Christian faith, be it cosmology or biology or evolutionary psychology. These folks are serious Christians, often at the very top of their field. And rather than having come from Christian families and just never having kind of got around to shedding their childhood faith, many of them had actually become believers and followers of Jesus in adulthood. One famous example over here is a guy called Francis Collins, who used to be the director of the Human Genome Project that first sequenced human DNA, and is now the head of the National Institute for Health in America. So one of the most influential scientists in the world today. And he became a Christian when he was a junior doctor, having grown up in a secular home over here, after a not very educated patient of his who was suffering from severe and untreatable pain, and was crying out to Jesus in her pain, asked her a simple question, "Doctor, what do you believe?" And that simple question from a much less educated patient started him on a voyage of discovery that ended up with him abandoning atheism and embracing Christianity. Science hasn't disproved God. In fact, contrary to Richard Dawkins and the new atheists, the very idea of modern science came to us from Christianity. Some of the top scientists in the world today stake their lives on their faith in a creator God. So that's our first point to consider as we wonder whether Christianity is dying out. Science hasn't disproved God. Second point is almost as surprising if you've listened to new atheist folks, and that's that humans aren't happier without God. Now Dawkins and his friends don't just think that the idea of a creator God is stupid and unnecessary. They've also argued that real psychological damage is done by this idea, especially by the unavoidable Christian belief that you and I are deeply morally corrupt. In the Bible, the language of that is talking about sinfulness. I have 3 kids who are 10, 8, and 2. And as a Christian, I'm bringing them up to believe that there is a creator God who made all of the universe and them, but also that they, like me, are not essentially good. But that their entire nature is shot through with sin, like a bag of flour crawling with maggots. And I'm telling them that their only hope of escaping the rightful judgment of an omnipotent creator God is if they put their trust in Jesus Christ, the Son of God who died on the cross to take the punishment their sins deserve. Now, Richard Dawkins says that raising kids on beliefs like this is tantamount to child abuse. Think of the psychological damage that I could be doing by telling my kids that they are by nature really very bad, so bad that someone had to die for them. I mean, think of what that could do to their self-esteem. Problem is, when we look at the actual data surrounding the psychological well-being both of kids and of adults, we find some surprising and sometimes counterintuitive results. Kids raised in religious homes attending religious services weekly are significantly less likely to suffer from depression than their non-religious peers. And we see similar effects in adulthood. For example, a large-scale study done by a group at Harvard, again down the road from me here, showed that women in America who attended church weekly were 5 times less likely to kill themselves than their non-religious peers. There have been study after study that's shown that actually regular religious participation, not just having a sort of general sense of spirituality, but actually kind of showing up to church once a week, has a really positive correlation with good mental and physical health outcomes. And it's not just down to community. There's another professor at Harvard named Tyler Vanderveel, who is a leading expert on these questions. And he's shown that the social support that you derive from showing up to sort of see the same group of people once a week accounts for only about a quarter of the positive effect of religious service attendance on people's health and happiness. So what else is at play? And perhaps it's a sense of meaning the belief in a creator God can bring. Perhaps it's knowing that my life has purpose, even when it's hard, and that the God who made me knows me completely and nonetheless loves me enough that he sent his son to die for me. Perhaps it's believing that my story is part of a much bigger story that God is telling throughout history, and that whatever happens now, my story's ending will be unimaginably good. Call it delusion if you like, but study after study has shown that actually humans aren't happier without belief in God, quite the reverse. And that brings us to our third point, which is that contrary to many people's expectations, humans don't behave better without God. Don't know if you remember back to the 1970s. I don't personally, but in 1971, the Beatles star John Lennon had a very famous dream. Closing his eyes to the atheist regimes of his day, he dreamed of a brotherhood of man with no heaven, no hell, no countries, no possessions, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion. I will spare you singing the song Imagine, but I'm guessing that many of you will be singing it in your heads right now. This song became an anthem to usher in a brave new world in which religion would finally be a thing of the past. You may remember the famous line, "You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one." 50 years later, this brave new world has not materialized for two reasons. Firstly, contrary to popular belief, the world hasn't become less religious, and it isn't going to anytime soon. And I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. Secondly, the brave, new, better, non-religious world hasn't come because taking away religion doesn't seem to make people behave better after all. Even Richard Dawkins himself, in his latest book, Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, had to acknowledge the evidence that religious people tend to behave better than their non-religious peers. Now, he says he finds it rather patronizing to say, well, of course, you and I are too intelligent to believe in God. We think it would be a good idea if other people did. But in light of the evidence, that's actually the most rational position for a convinced atheist to take. Looking at data from America, atheist social psychologist Jonathan Haidt puts it like this. Surveys have long shown that religious believers in the United States are happier, healthier, longer lived, and more generous to charity and to each other than a secular people. Religious believers give more money than secular folk to secular charities and to their neighbours. They give more of their time too, and of their blood. And when we dig down through the topsoil of ethics, we find an even bigger problem for atheists like my Harvard professor friend. It's not just that religious people tend to behave better toward their fellow humans in a range of ways. It turns out that even our definition of what it means to behave ethically has come to us from Christianity. Now, in America, where I live, the Declaration of Independence declares, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." But actually, it turns out that's not a self-evident truth at all. The idea that all human beings have equal worth, regardless of their race or sex or age or capabilities, the idea that the strong and the rich and the powerful have a moral responsibility to care for and not trample on the weak and the poor and the dispossessed, the idea of basic universal human rights, these all actually came to us from Christianity. And without Christianity, we have no fundamental reason to believe them anymore. I've found this book fascinating. Yuval Noah Harari's best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, a global bestseller written a few years ago by an atheist Israeli historian. And as Harari puts it, Homo sapiens has no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. It was realizing this that drove a friend of mine who was one of the only people who knew both me and my husband before we knew each other, from atheism to Christianity. Sarah and I met when we were both doing PhDs at Cambridge. She's now a history professor at a university in Australia where she comes from. And she was a convinced atheist when she came to Cambridge to do her PhD. She was a convinced atheist when she went to Oxford to do her postdoc. But while she was at Oxford, she went to a series of lectures by a fellow Australian, a world-famous atheist philosopher called Peter Singer. And as she listened to Singer talk, she experienced what she later described as a sort of intellectual vertigo. And she realized that her atheism stuck a knife in the back of all of her deepest moral beliefs. She had thought that Christianity was the enemy of racial justice, care for the poor, equality for men and women, but she gradually discovered it was the basis for those things. And so she ended up becoming a Christian. She describes her process of discovering Christianity like this. Christianity was, to my surprise, radical, far more radical than the leftist ideologies to which I'd been previously enamored. The love of God was unlike anything which I expected or of which I could make sense. In becoming fully human in Jesus, God behaved decidedly unlike a God. Why deign to walk through death's dark valley or hold the weeping limbs of lepers if you are God? Why submit to humiliation and death on a cross in order to save those who hate you? God suffered punishment in our place because of a radical love. This sacrificial love is utterly opposed to the individualism, consumerism, exploitation, and objectification of our culture. As Sarah realized, that this sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, which lies at the heart of Christian ethics, and which, according to one of Jesus' first followers, actually defines what love is. A follower of his called John wrote in the New Testament, this is how we know what love is, that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and so we ought to lay down our lives for one another. This lies absolutely at the heart of Christian ethics. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been a Christian for a long time, and I fail to live like this every day. If you knew my thoughts, you would probably be shocked by how morally bad I am. And the message of Christianity is absolutely not that we Christians think that we are so good that we get to live with God forever. It's actually that we realize we're so bad that Jesus had to die to make us right with God. But owning Jesus as Lord means you have to take seriously his call to sacrificial love. And all the data shows that humans don't behave better without belief in God. In fact, in a 2018 book by the philosopher Christian Miller called The Character Gap, How Good Are We?, he observes that literally hundreds of studies link religious participation with better moral outcomes. So that's our third point. Humans aren't better without God. And that brings us to the last and fourth point, which directly addresses the question of this session. Christianity isn't shrinking, it's actually growing. Now, 40 years ago, pretty much every sociologist of religion agreed that as the world became more modern, more educated, more scientific, religious belief would naturally decline. It's what had happened largely in Western Europe. And so the theory was, where Western Europe led, the rest of the world must follow. But that prophecy has failed. What's more, as sociologists now look out over the next 40 years to 2060, they anticipate an increasingly religious world. Today, Christianity is by far the largest and most racially and culturally diverse belief system in the world. About 31% of the world identifies as Christian, and that proportion is set to increase slightly to 32% by 2060. Islam is the second largest belief system, and Islam is expected to increase significantly from about 24% of the world today to 31% by 2060, making it a very close competitor with Christianity. Buddhism and Hinduism are each set to decline slightly. And the proportion of people who don't identify with any religion, which includes atheists, agnostics, and just folks who would say they're nuns in modern terms. They don't identify with any particular religious group. That proportion is set to decline from 16% to 13%. So the tide isn't going out on religion globally, it's actually coming in. And one of the most surprising parts of this story is what's happening in China. China today is the global center of atheism, but the church in China is growing so fast that experts think there will be more Christians in China than in America by 2030. And some even think that China could be a majority Christian country by 2060. At that point, as much as 40% of the world's Christians are expected to be living in sub-Saharan Africa as well. So far from being declining religion of white Westerners, Christianity is a growing religion of the North, South, East, and West. Now, this has massive implications for how we think, especially those of us in any way involved in the academic world. You see, for decades, the idea that modernization would bring global secularization has operated in the university not just as a diagnosis, but also as a prescription. It's not just what will happen, but what should happen. So what are Western intellectuals going to do when they realize that it isn't happening? And that far from atheism being the belief system of diversity and progress, it's actually the belief system of white Western men and communist regimes. Professor Fan Gangyang is a leading sociologist of religion in China, and he argues that the Western academy is going to have to go through a paradigm shift, much like a scientific revolution. That's his comparison. When the failure of the so-called secularization hypothesis, this idea that religion in general is declining, comes home to roost. We can no longer act like belief in God in general, and Christianity in particular is going to be driven out by more education, more understanding of science, greater racial and cultural diversity, more concern for people's mental health, or better ethics. Because Christianity, it turns out, is by any reasonable measure the greatest intellectual and ethical movement of all history. Is it crazy for me to believe that a Middle Eastern Jewish man who lived 2,000 years ago was truly the creator God in human form? Yes. Is it crazy for me to believe that his death on the cross paid the price for our sins so that anyone who puts their trust in him can be forgiven? Yes. Is it crazy for me to believe that he was raised from the dead to conquer death and to bring new life to broken people? Yes. All these are crazy, unbelievable beliefs. The problem is, there is no more rational alternative. Francis Collins, who I mentioned earlier, the director of the National Institute of Health over here, one of the most influential scientists in the world, summarized how he thought about his faith like this. He said that actually, as he began to try and understand why intellectually sophisticated people could actually believe in God, to his dismay, he found that atheism turned out to be the least rational of all the choices. Now, at the beginning of my talk, I claimed that science hasn't disproved God, rather that belief in a creator God is the best foundation for science. Point two, I said that humans aren't happier without God, rather regular religious participation correlates with more happiness and better mental health. Point three was that humans aren't better without God, but that actively religious people behave in more pro-social ways, and that Christianity is also the basis for our fundamental moral beliefs. And number four, that Christianity isn't shrinking, it's growing. And I'm sure that I've raised a lot of questions and a host of objections, so I look forward to Q&A time. But I just want to end with this. Don't dismiss the possibility that there is a creator God who loves you enough that he came to die for you. Because some of the cleverest people in the world think that that's true. In fact, they would stake their lives on it.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca. Well, that has really stirred things up on the Q&A board. Brilliant. That's exactly what we want. You have divided your audience. I can see by the questions coming in of some people who are agreeing with you, some people who really want to push back. There is another couple of minutes if you want to get involved with the question and answers. I know some people like to wait to the end of the talk before going across to Pigeonhole and putting their questions in or voting for other questions. So if you'd like to do that, now is your kind of good opportunity before we get into some of those questions. David, I wonder if you could put up those two website addresses for us and for Rebecca while that goes on, because if you want to find out more about Rebecca and about some of the work that she's doing, her blog, some of her publications, that is all there at RebeccaMcLaughlin.org. If you want to find out any more about us at SOLAS, we are there at solas-cpc.org. And then very quickly, Rebecca, before we get into the Q&A, could you just tell us a little bit about your new book, which is coming out, is it in April? Is that right?
Yes, yeah. It's a strange thing over here that people often express their political and other views with things called yard signs, which I don't think, they certainly don't exist in England. I'm guessing they don't in Scotland either. But in America, people call their garden their yard. And if they feel sort of strongly about something, they'll stick a little sign in their yard on two little legs that often, as I say, traditionally it's which political candidate they're voting for. But in the part of America where I live, most common sign that I see says something like this: in this house, we believe that Black Lives Matter, love is love, women's rights are human rights. And then fascinatingly, there are sort of usually three other claims, but it can totally depend on the yard sign. It could be like diversity makes us stronger, or no human is illegal, or science is real, or water is life. But those three, Black Lives Matter, love is love, and women's rights, human rights, are often first and foremost in that mix. So I've written a book coming out in April called The Secular Creed, examining 5 contemporary claims, where I look at those 3 and others. And what I'm doing is sort of saying, from a Christian perspective, what do we make of these claims? Spoiler alert, from a Christian perspective, Black lives absolutely matter, 100%, no question. And one of the things I look at is how that claim has sort of been tied, especially in American consciousness, I think, but it's somewhat true in the UK as well, to the claim that love is love, and how I actually don't think those two statements belong together. So there's a whole nother couple of areas of controversy.
You like controversies. That's great. So The Secular Creed, Rebecca McLaughlin, and when is that published?
That's coming out in April.
April. Excellent. Okay, Q&A time. Are you ready? There are some interesting questions in here. So I hope you're ready for this. Okay, let's just start at the top. The voting is kind of moving the questions around even as we speak. So Steve writes, I agree that God's work continues, but are Christians, and in particular Bible-believing Christians, too enculturated that their witness is terribly weakened and their message compromised?
Yes.
Anything you'd like to add to that?
I think one of the brilliant things about Christianity, and I think this is a sort of objectively true as well as something that I believe because I'm a Christian, is that it has never been culturally specific. What I mean by that is, if you look at the Bible itself, you see from the beginning that the church was multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multiple languages being spoken, people from all sorts of different places that shouldn't have got on with each other. There was this coming together of people from different backgrounds. And Christianity has spread since then to all sorts of different countries and has no problem at all with being fully in that culture, whether it's the language that the Bible is read in and translated into, or whether it's the sort of clothes that Christians should wear, or whether it's the food that Christians should eat. There are many things about Christianity that are completely kind of transcultural or adaptable to different cultures. And that's a beautiful ethic, actually, that comes out of Christianity, this belief in love across difference, whether it's racial difference or cultural difference or national difference, is deeply entrenched in New Testament ethics. But one of the things that the Bible warns against, in particular, whatever culture you're in, is the danger of being rich. And the way that plays out is folks like me, and most likely like others on this call, is that if we have material comforts, we in biblical terms are actually the spiritually disadvantaged. and that there are real risks to being wealthy. And I think especially as a Christian living in a country where not only do I have sort of material benefits, but I also have protections of my faith. I'm not a Christian in China today, where actually you could be arrested for being a Christian. I'm a Christian in America, where that's extraordinarily unlikely to happen. And I think there is a real danger of complacency and of a comfortable Christianity that has very little to do with Jesus of Nazareth and what the Bible is actually saying. So I think the risk is very real. Fortunately, I don't think the hope for the church globally is actually rich, comfortable Christians. I think it's poor, persecuted Christians.
Thank you for that. Okay. I want to come down to a question here that's also sort of voted to the top of the pile. Clem is right, but the board is moving as I speak as people are voting. So Clem writes, Christianity is not dying in the developing world, but it is where we have access to education. As Professor Dawkins has shown, the more degrees we have, the fewer faith heads we get. Bright, not bishops, please.
Yeah, so again, Dawkins, he tells a good tale, but frankly, his data is often pretty faulty. And I say that it was interesting reading his latest, I don't think he's written anything since Outgrowing God, his kind of youth version of helping young people realize that they don't need God anymore. Because there, for the first time, having read some of his other books, for the first time, he was having to acknowledge some things that previously, frankly, wouldn't have acknowledged. Like, for example, that actually people who believe in God do behave better than people who don't. But he has this strong push that links religious belief to lack of education. Now, there's a strand of truth in that connected to what I was just saying, which is actually the Bible is very strongly on the side of the poor against the rich. And globally, and like in any society, the likelihood is that richer people are going to be more educated than poor. So it is true that if you did if you monitored the education levels of Christians around the world, you'd find many who are poor and uneducated. However, if you look globally today, Christians are some of the most educated people globally, actually more educated on average than atheists. So to pull some exact stats on this, but there's especially as well, Christian women are much more likely to be educated relative to Christian men than some folks in other kind of religious and non-religious belief settings. And what's interesting as well, and these figures are from the US, but while nominally religious people are more likely to declare themselves non-religious if they get more education, actually professing Christians who are regularly participating, like going to church, like active Christians, are not less likely to be active Christians if they're more educated. In fact, highly educated Christians are more likely to be weekly churchgoers in the US, for example. So it's actually not the tale that Dawkins tells is quite misleading, because I think he recognize, or he notices the fact that more educated people are more likely to be sort of clear about what they don't believe if they're not believers, rather than just sort of say they're Christians when clearly they're not. Frankly, I think that's a good thing. But it's not true that there's a sort of simple correlation between like the more educated you get, the less likely you are to believe.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that, Clem. You may want to come back on that and question some of those things. If you missed any of that, this is recorded. And so if you're on our YouTube channel, you can just rewind and go back to the beginning and catch any of those things, because that was quick and there was a lot in there. Okay, moving on. Thank you for that, Clem.
Sign on that, Gavin. Almost everything I say, not quite, but the vast majority of things I've said today, the footnotes are in my book. So if you do actually want to kind of figure out, what I'm citing here, it's all in the footnotes.
That's genius product placement. Thank you for that. Okay, Joy Haddon has put in a thing here and saying, if what you've just said is true, are the media, the press, somewhat to blame for so many people thinking that Christianity is dead? And how do we get better Christian PR in the broad kind of media? Is this a media problem more than a factual problem? Thanks, Joy.
Yeah, so it's definitely true that the story, like the headline, Christian gives to charity, isn't good. Like, that's not an interesting news story, right? It's much more interesting if you can find, study shows that Christians are less altruistic than atheists. Like, suddenly everybody wants to hear about that because it sort of feels surprising somehow, or it feels like a takedown of Christianity. There's actually a famous one of those that went around a few years ago, claiming to show that religious people were less religious kids in religious families were markedly less altruistic than kids raised in atheist families. And this was sort of trumpeted abroad by every media outlet that could get their hands on it. Subsequently, it turned out there were massive flaws in how that study was done, and it's been actually kind of had to be retracted because it was so flawed in its methodology. You don't get the headlines that then say, actually, that thing that we trumpeted abroad a couple of years ago has been substantially discredited now. You don't tend to get it. So there's an extent to which it's true, and we hear the headline news like major celebrity pastor caught in terrible sex scandal is news. Pastor lives faithful life and dies faithful death is just kind of, that's not news. So it is true with Christianity and with life in general that newspapers are more likely to report negative stories than they are to report positive ones. In terms of PR, I think it's also true and worth acknowledging that Christians say and do some really stupid and bad things, often in public. I live in America where there's no shortage of this, possibly even more so in the UK, of people identifying as Christians doing really stupid and or immoral things in public. And so I think if those of us who are Christians sort of have to own that to some extent and say, this is our mess that we are making. I don't think we can just sort of blame it on the media out there. I think in terms of how Christianity can have kind of quite better PR, I think part of it is by cultivating the sorts of character traits that the Bible calls us to, including humility, actually. I think we're too quick often as Christians to be sort of flame-throwing and arrogant, when actually we should cultivate humility, especially as we are disagreeing with others and speaking across ideological differences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Now, you made those 4 kind of very bold, stark claims in your talk, and during that talk, this comment came in, which I think sort of picking up on that and says, all this sounds good. So this is what you were saying there. All this sounds good until you see the church and Christians. They look like they don't even believe it themselves, and there's certainly plenty of sin there. So how would you respond to the idea? Sounds good, but what I see in practice just horrifies me. So any thoughts on that?
No, important question. And I think there are 2 strands to it, if I'm hearing it correctly. One is Christians looking like they don't really believe it themselves. It's funny that the church that I go to here delightfully has people worshiping who come from all sorts of different countries and cultures. So like the Bible study group that I lead, we have a Brazilian lady, we have a Ghanaian Korean lady, we have an Ethiopian lady, we have people from Eastern Europe and Latin America. Like it's sort of all comers, which is fabulous. And one of the questions that I sometimes ask people who have grown up or have become Christians in other countries and continents and moved to multiple parts of the world here is, how do they experience church here differently from where they come from? And what I often hear them say is, people here are far less enthusiastic in church than where I come from, whether it's Ghana or whether it's Peru, right? And that's striking to me. I suspect it's also true in the UK that often the way that we worship may not always look like we believe that we are meeting with the Creator God, that we believe in a man who was raised from the dead, that we are filled with the Holy Spirit, like these crazy things that Christians believe. It doesn't always sort of light up our faces as it should. And I think there's room for cultural difference there, that like a very enthusiastic British man might, put his hands in his pockets in a especially excited sort of way, while a Latin American woman might be waving her arms in the air. And I think that's fine. So if your experience of Christians is that they lack visible enthusiasm for their beliefs, then maybe go to a more multicultural church where you'll see people operating in different ways. The second part of the question, you can maybe read it again to me, Gavin, but I think it was about like churches are full of sinners. Is that
everything you said sounds good until you see the church. They don't look like they believe it themselves, and there's lots of sin there. So
yes, and so this is the paradox of one of the paradoxes of being a Christian, is that as a Christian, I believe that I have been completely forgiven for my sin because of Jesus's death in my place, and that in a meaningful and important sense, it's been taken away from me as far as the east is from the west, as the Bible puts it, or it's been like thrown into the bottom of the sea. There is, as God looks at me, simply because I trust in Jesus, he sees only Jesus' goodness and not my sinfulness. But the Bible also teaches, and I'm thankful because otherwise I would not think that I was a Christian. The Bible also teaches that I will, till the day I die, struggle with sin. It's like a kind of old nature and a new nature sort of battling it out together. And as I participate, even as I individually participate in local Christian community here, I'm meeting other people who are sinful, and I'm bringing my own sin into the equation. And often that is not pretty. The comparison that I'd make is that, and this is a comparison the Bible makes as well, that the church is like a family. I'm sure if we sat down with every person on this call and asked them about their family and asked them about bad things that have been done in their family, or experience, like really negative experience that they'd had in their families, we would have story after story. We might have very good stories as well, but we'd have lots of stories of people whose father abused them by like beating them, or whose mother struggled with alcoholism and neglected them, or whose sister completely abandoned them emotionally as they're growing up. Like, we probably, all of us, or at least many of us, would have really painful stories to tell about our families. The conclusion from that is not that families are bad, but that we need to work towards being healthy families. And so similarly, I think with churches, any church that I join is going to have at least one sinner, which is me, and actually any person in that church is also going to be a sinner. And we can work together to grow in our likeness to Jesus, which is what we're aspiring to as Christians, is very gradually to become a little bit more like him. But we are always going to have the struggles of sin, and sometimes that will be sort of private and invisible, and sometimes it will be very public and visible. I don't think we should be surprised. Like, I think we should lament it, but we shouldn't be surprised by it from a Christian perspective. It's what the Bible tells us to expect.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, moving on, because the clock is moving and we're going to do some more questions. Roger Marshall, here's a very interesting question. He refers to the well-known writers Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, who you may well have come across both those gentlemen. So Roger Marshall writes this: Doug Murray refers to the God-shaped hole in the world, but why are former skeptics like him and Tom Holland so reluctant to follow this perception to a God-shaped conclusion?
I confess ignorance of the other gentleman you mentioned, but Tom Holland, I have his book right here. It's a very short book, but it's worth reading, partly because it makes the case at much greater length that I very briefly sketched out when I was talking earlier, which is that the reason that we believe in things like universal human rights or equality and care for the poor and love across different, all these kind of things that we think are basic moral common sense, are actually Christian beliefs. And he makes that case by looking back over 2,000 years of Christian history, warts and all, but says actually, when we look at the world into which Christianity was born, we don't find a world in which people believe these things and hold them to be self-evident. And if we look at cultures untouched by Christianity today, we don't see that either. So for all the failures of Christians over the last 2,000 years, actually Christianity has defined what goodness is and given us an opportunity to participate in that. Now, I don't know Tom Holland personally. My sense from sort of watching the things that he's saying is that he is gradually progressing toward a place where he would be wanting to identify as a Christian. So I wouldn't lose hope for somebody like him yet. I do think that, especially those of us who grew up in a world that expected that religion was declining, and that it probably wasn't intellectually tenable, even if it was sort of desirable, like even if we don't want to believe in Yuval Noah Harari's world of sapiens without God, where there is no good and no evil, really, there's just sort of animal interactions and atoms and molecules, that we're sort of not allowed to, because Christianity just isn't sort of intellectually tenable. I think the relief valve can be kind of taken off that if we start listening to the thousands of Christian intellectuals who God has placed at the top of all sorts of fields at all sorts of universities across the world, and started to see that actually Christianity, when you look closely at it, holds up very well intellectually. For all its strange claims, actually it holds up better than any other belief system.
And I think what he's pushing out there is there a limit to how far apologetics and the life of the mind can take you towards God? Is something more needed? Can you argue your way to saying, I need this, it fits, it works, but I'm not convinced it's true, and I can't actually plant my flag there? Is there a limit to apologetics on its own? Is something more needed?
Yeah, one of the odd beliefs that Christians like me hold is that we're actually all spiritually blind until God opens our eyes. So there is a reality that the most persuasive argument in the world wouldn't actually cause somebody to put their trust in Jesus, and if God hasn't opened their eyes. So there's truth to that. I think there's also the reality which Jonathan Haidt, who I mentioned earlier, atheist social psychologist, is very interesting on, that we like to think of ourselves as predominantly rational beings, with also some sort of emotional, social things thrown in. But like really, we're, our thinking happens here and our heart is, sort of following along. We like to think of ourselves that way. Actually, the metaphor that Jonathan Haidt uses is that if you imagine a rider on top of an elephant, the little rider sitting on top is our rational self, and the elephant is our kind of everything else, like our emotional, social, instinctive self. And that often what we do when we're trying to persuade somebody else is we speak only to the rational rider on the top. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if you speak just to a rational rider on the top and try to tell somebody that everything they've ever believed is not actually correct, or at least a substantial proportion of it, whether it's on a political question or on a question of religious belief, they're not going to listen unless you talk to the elephant. And that really all of us, like however much we think that we're independent agents, we actually make our decisions in the context of our communities. And so I think sometimes that the missing link for folks is if we only focus on the sort of purely intellectual, rational argument piece, and we're forgetting that human beings are much more than that. Rightly so. Like I don't think it's a bad thing that we're much more than that. But that actually our social and emotional self is at least as important, probably more so, and that that's why Christian hospitality in its various forms is so important.
Thank you. Gordon has picked up on something you said in your talk about the growth of the Chinese church. Let me read you Gordon's question, because he's picked up particularly something you said about the potential in 2060 of Chinese Christians outnumbering American Christians. And he says, what will the impact of that be on world mission? And how will the American church react when they are a minority and they are outnumbered by Chinese Christians?
Yeah, so there are two separate claims that I said quickly together, which is probably why they've got mixed up. The first is that it seems highly likely that by 2030, so a little less than a decade from now, there'll be more Christians in China than in America. Now, China, as you probably know, is an extremely big country. So that doesn't mean that most Chinese people will be Christians. But it does mean that actually, if you compare the church in China to the church in America, church in China will be bigger. Fangeng Yang, who I mentioned, who is one of the leading experts of sociology of religion in China, he's a professor at Purdue University over here. He says that if the Chinese church continues on anything even close to the rate of growth that it's seen since the 80s, I think it is, like several decades now, that if that continues, that by 2060, there could be more Christians in China than anything else, as in it could be more than 50% of people identifying as Christians in China. Now, fascinatingly, and this is something I haven't touched on this talk, but I find it so interesting, Christianity has always been a majority female movement. No offense to you guys, but actually from the first, it seems like there were a disproportionate number of women following Jesus versus men, and the church in China is very much following that pattern as well. It seems probably at least 2/3 of folks identifying as Christians in China are women, which is particularly striking given that there's a disproportionate number of men in China due to selective abortion and infanticide and the one-child policy. So yeah, by 2060, it seems like there could be more Christians in China than anything else. What impact will that have on the world? Gosh, all sorts, right? I mean, it's sort of amazing to think, even if I sort of take off the hat of somebody who actually believes in Jesus and thinks that it is truly the most wonderful thing in the world if anybody becomes a Christian. Like, even if I set that aside and imagine I'm looking at this purely from a like practical perspective, to have China be largely framed and informed by Christian ethics rather than by communism would be an extremely good thing, both for China and for the world in general. How America would feel about that, I mean, I partly don't care. Like, no, that's too sort of strongly put. I think one of the big switches that needs to happen in the white church in America, and it's a loaded term, but the churches in America that are majority white, is to recognize that Christianity is not and never has been actually a kind of white man's religion. Not to say that white people haven't been Christians, they absolutely have. Not to say that Western culture and white Western culture hasn't been shaped by Christianity, it absolutely has. But actually Christianity has always been multi-ethnic, multicultural, multiracial. And the history of white supremacy and racism in America that's been sort of intertwined with white churches in many ways is utterly abhorrent to what the Bible teaches us, like completely irreconcilable. So I think there are some sort of wake-up calls that need to happen within America itself. And I think recognizing actually many of the people who are serious followers of Jesus don't look like the white evangelical American. My hope is that it will be an encouragement and a help to white Christians in America. I think some who are maybe obviously less committed to Jesus than they are to their own sort of ethnic identity, it'll be a struggle.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That links into a question that's been kind of working its way up the board as you've been speaking, because you've talked about growth in other parts of the world in the church, and this one's anonymous, and it reflects on the fact that we do have a long-term decline in church attendance in certainly in Scotland. To what extent is the Western Church to blame? Have we become too comfortable, too materialistic, and far too lazy? So, are we the weak part of a global movement that is thriving, and is it actually a problem that we've got to deal with?
I mean, yeah, basically. That's not the only answer. What's happening in the West, for sure, is a decline in kind of cultural Christianity. So far fewer people are showing up to church just because it's what you do if you're Scottish, or what you do if you're English, or what you do if you're American. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think from my perspective as someone who takes the claims of the Bible very seriously, I would actually rather somebody knew they weren't a Christian than somebody who thought they were when they're not. And often the sort of cultural frame, my husband, for example, grew up in Oklahoma in the Bible Belt in America. And then he went to Cambridge for his PhD, and it was sort of a real shift for him, because in Oklahoma, like, most of his friends went to church, even though he didn't kind of respected the fact that he did. And when he went to Cambridge, it was like, you're totally a weirdo for going to church. Like, it was just an odd. He looked around church on a Sunday and he was like, everybody here really wants to be here. They're like truly serious about this following Jesus stuff, because otherwise it doesn't make you cool like it did in Oklahoma. And he remembers then going back to Oklahoma and it being kind of unsettling to think, the reality is, I think some of my friends, you can't judge someone else's heart, but it doesn't seem like they're actually necessarily authentic followers of Jesus. I think they're just kind of going along with what other people are doing, and this is kind of what the cool thing to do is. As I say, I think that sense of cultural Christianity has been declining for a while, both in the UK and in the US. And I don't think it's a terrible thing. I think it's an opportunity for us to actually focus on real Christianity, and to take seriously the Bible's call on us in all sorts of dimensions, both ethical and also in terms of like sharing the message of Jesus with others outside the church. And I don't think it does us any harm to feel a sort of loss of cultural power, because the first Christians weren't operating in a world where they had cultural power, quite the reverse. And Jesus says that anyone who wants to come after him must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. in his day, that could mean literally being killed. In China today, that could mean literally being killed. In many parts of the world where Christians are living as a persecuted minority, that could mean literally being killed. There's something very clarifying about knowing that your life could be on the line for following Jesus that none of us growing up in the West have experienced. So is it a problem that we need to own? Yes. Is it only a bad thing? I don't know that it is. And I haven't looked at the stats on England recently, but in America at least, folks regularly participating and going to church, like churches that are teaching the Bible, actually hasn't declining. Like that number's been holding pretty steadily as folks going to kind of more theologically liberal churches or folks just sort of culturally identifying as Christians has declined.
Our time has gone. I just want to say thank you to you for joining us, Rebecca. That was really as controversial as we hoped. Wonderful. Thank you. That was great. Can we put up the slide, please, David, of some further resources? We'd like to point people in the direction of some things that might be helpful for them if they want to read a bit further. Obviously, Rebecca's book, which I was waving around earlier on, Confronting Christianity, has got loads more on all these big questions that face the Christian faith. God's Unwelcome Recovery by Sean Oliver D looks at some of the stats and the things that are going on behind the picture of church decline that we often hear. And then Whose Religion is Christianity by Lamin Sena looks at the way that Christianity isn't owned by any one group, such as white, middle-class evangelical Americans, for example, but moves from continent to continent and is owned by the whole world. I've put Rebecca's website address up there again for you. So anything else you want to know about what she does, including her new book, which is coming out in April, she said, The Secular Creed, one to add to Confronting Christianity there. So that just leaves me to point out that we've got a conference coming up soon online. The Confronting Christianity conference was going to only be with churches in Hereford, but because we can't travel to Hereford, it is now open to the whole world via the internet. If you want to join Andy Bannister, Gareth Black and Christy Mayer there for Confident Christianity, follow the link that you can see on the screen. A whole day of this kind of thing that you've been enjoying for the last hour. That just leaves me to say thanks again to Rebecca McLaughlin for joining us. That was hugely appreciated. Thank you to all those of you who contributed to the Q&A, both voting for the questions and firing in some really helpful questions this evening. Thank you to David Hartnett for producing, and thank you for watching. We pray that this has been a useful session for you, and may God bless you. Good night.